After my millionaire grandfather died and left me everything, my parents who'd ignored me for 30 years dragged me into court to rip it all away. The moment I walked into that courtroom, my mom rolled her eyes like I was an inconvenience, another burden she never wanted. But the judge, he froze. He stared at me as if he'd just seen a ghost. "Wait, the charges are against you," he said, his voice cutting through the room. And in that second, I realized something almost tragic. They were about to go to war with a man they never even bothered to know. They had no idea who I had become or what I was capable of, and by the time they found out, it was already too late. My name is Troy Calum Wynn, and this is the part of my life I never thought I'd say out loud. Before I share my story, I want to know you're here with me. Just say "listening" in the comments, or tell me where you are. I love hearing how far my story reaches. Sometimes even the smallest connection makes a story feel heard. Thank you. And now, here's my story. If my voice reaches you today, please consider subscribing. It helps more than you know, especially for someone who spent most of his life feeling unheard. The moment I pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the Denver Superior Court, the air tightened around me like a noose. Every step echoed as if the room itself was holding its breath. My mother, Nadine, spotted me first. She rolled her eyes with that familiar mixture of annoyance and contempt she'd perfected long before I ever learned to speak. My father, Gregory, regarded me with a smirk that wasn't quite a smile, more like amusement twisted with ridicule, as if he already expected me to embarrass myself. Walking toward them felt less like entering a courtroom, and more like walking straight onto a battlefield where the people aiming at me shared my blood. I kept my gaze steady as I approached the defense table, pretending not to notice how several heads turned. But I noticed everything: the sharp inhale, the murmurs dying mid-sentence, the sudden shift of posture across the room. When I looked up at the bench, Judge Miller had paused mid-page, his glasses sliding down the bridge of his nose as his eyes locked onto me. For a moment, he didn't speak. Then he set his papers down, slowly studying my face like he was trying to match it with a memory he hadn't expected to confront today. "You're Troy Calum Wynn. You're the defendant in this case," he asked, his voice carrying just enough surprise to ripple through the room. The silence that followed was suffocating. Even the air conditioner stopped humming. I felt every pair of eyes land on me, puzzled, confused, stunned. The attorney representing my parents shifted uncomfortably, clearly thrown off by the judge's reaction. And I knew exactly why. Because I wasn't just the man being dragged to court. I wasn't the neglected son they assumed would crumble under pressure or retreat into silence the way I always had as a child. I was a senior prosecutor for the state of Colorado, someone who'd put away men twice as dangerous as my parents would ever be. But they never knew. In 30 years, not once had they asked who I was becoming, what I did with my life, or what kind of man their absence had shaped me into. Their ignorance wasn't an accident, it was a pattern. A part of me simmered with anger, another part felt strangely calm, as if I'd been preparing for this moment far longer than I realized. Every hidden scar, every quiet night in my grandfather's cabin, every choice they never witnessed had led me to this. Standing in that courtroom, I understood something in a way I never had before. This was the beginning of the truth unraveling. Their truth. My truth. The one they'd spent years pretending didn't exist. And as I sat down, placing my hands deliberately on the table, I whispered to myself, if they want a war over my grandfather's legacy, then they're about to face the part of me they never bothered to know. I grew up in Aspen, Colorado, but not in the way people picture when they hear the name. No cozy family breakfasts, no parents cheering at school games, no warm Christmas mornings. My mother, Nadine Dorrance, came from a wealthy real estate dynasty, the kind obsessed with maintaining their pristine image. My father, Gregory Wynn, was a rising politician who cared more about shaking hands than holding his own child. I wasn't part of their plan. I was the complication they tried to clean up quietly. When I was just a few months old, they sent me away to live with my grandfather, Laredo Wynn, in Telluride. The excuse was always the same: they weren't ready, they needed time. Parenthood would derail their ambitions. But the truth was simpler and sharper. I didn't fit the picture-perfect narrative they were building. I would have blurred the edges of their success. Telluride became my first real home. My grandfather's cabin sat tucked between pine trees and snowbanks, creaking in the winter winds, glowing gold from the fireplace at night. The radio in the corner played old jazz, and the smell of wood smoke clung to every blanket in the house. That was where I learned everything that mattered. My grandfather taught me how to think, really think, how to dissect an argument, how to hold firm in a debate, how to follow logic instead of fear. And above all, he taught me that a man's worth was tied to the promises he kept, not the family he came from. My parents visited occasionally, though visited is generous. They appeared a few times a year, always rushed, always distracted, always leaving before dinner. I remember watching them drive away each time, their taillights disappearing down the snowy road, leaving behind that familiar ache in my chest, a mix of hope shrinking into disappointment. For a long time, I thought their absence was unintentional. I convinced myself they were busy, overworked, or simply struggling to balance their lives. I told myself stories to soften the truth. But the truth didn't soften. The truth hit me the night I was 15. I had come downstairs to grab a glass of water when I heard my mother's voice on the phone. Her tone was sharp, impatient, almost cold. "He's just a tool, Greg," she snapped. "Your father sends the money every month because of him. If we take him back, we lose that." I stopped breathing. Every word sliced deeper than the last. I realized then that my presence in their lives had never been wanted. My existence had been a transaction, nothing more, nothing less. I stood there in the dark hallway, gripping the banister, feeling the foundation of my world collapse under me. But something else rose in its place. A quiet truth. A painful clarity. I wasn't kept because I was loved. I was kept because my grandfather loved me enough for all of us. And as that chapter of my life closed, a new one began inside me, a silent promise that one day I would define myself without them. As I moved through the last years of high school and into college, my grandfather became the single constant in my life, the one person whose presence felt like gravity. Every Sunday night, no matter how exhausted he was from a week of reading case files, or how drained I was from exams and part-time work, we sat across from each other at the old wooden table in the cabin. He always began the same way, leaning back, slightly, fingers intertwined, eyes sharp and calm. "What did you learn about people this week?" he would ask. Not what I learned in school, not what grade I earned, but what I understood about human nature. His questions carved out the foundation that would one day pull me toward becoming a prosecutor. He didn't raise me on rules. He raised me on principles. Everything shifted the year I turned 17. It was winter, bitter and loud outside the cabin when my grandfather collapsed in the kitchen. The stroke was mild, but the fear was not. I missed weeks of school to take care of him, helping him walk, making his meals, reading to him when the headaches were too heavy. My parents lived less than 3 hours away at the time, yet not once did they show up to see him. Not a call, not a message. I tried to convince myself they didn't know how bad it was, but even at 17, lies like that didn't survive long. When I was accepted into the University of Chicago to study law, he celebrated more than I did. I can still hear him telling me, "You're the only one in this family who understands what honor means." He said it softly, not as praise, but as a truth he'd carried for years. I believed him because he earned belief from me the way he earned everything else, in quiet, consistent ways. During winter break of my second year, I came home to Telluride expecting the usual hot tea by the fireplace, my grandfather asking me about my classes, maybe a long walk through the snow. Instead, I found him sitting at the dining table with his attorney. Papers were spread out, and his expression was heavier than I'd ever seen it. He waved me over his hand, trembling just slightly, and told me he wanted me to witness a change he was making. He revised his will that day. Every property, every investment, every dollar he saved through decades on the bench, he left all of it to me. When I asked why, he didn't hesitate. "Because you've shown up more in my life than all of them put together. No anger, no bitterness. Just a fact delivered with the same calm he used when teaching me law." It didn't take long for my parents to find out. They arrived in Telluride unannounced, stomping through the snow like a storm in human form. My mother accused me of manipulating him. My father claimed I exploited his condition. They spoke as though I'd stolen something from them, something they believed they were entitled to by blood alone. My grandfather stood there frail from recovery, yet still iron-willed. He ordered them out before the sun had even set. Snow was falling so hard that night we could barely see the road, but he didn't waver. He protected me the way they never had. Later, before I returned to Chicago, he held my wrist gently as if settling the weight of something invisible into my hands. "They will come back someday," he said. "Not for you, but for what I've left. And when that happens, don't you dare tremble." I didn't know then how prophetic those words would be, but I felt them settle deep inside me, a warning shaped like love. I was in the Denver District Attorney's office, buried in a financial fraud case, when my phone buzzed with a call that froze the world around me. My grandfather had passed away in his sleep. The words fell flat, like they couldn't possibly belong to someone as steady and enduring as him. I felt something inside me split open, the kind of break you don't hear until silence floods in after it. Driving back to Telluride felt like retracing old footsteps, while knowing I'd never hear his voice echoing down the hallway again. The cabin was colder than I remembered, untouched and quiet, still carrying the scent of cedar and old books. Every chair seemed to hold a ghost of him. As I walked through the rooms, the memories pressed against me like fingers on my back, guiding and haunting at the same time. His attorney met me there, handing me a sealed envelope with my name written in his handwriting, steady, precise. He said, "You should open this only after the funeral," the attorney told me. I tucked it away, already sensing it carried something heavier than words. The funeral was small, dignified, the way he lived. My parents and my sister Sienna arrived late, wrapped in expensive coats and an even colder demeanor. They greeted no one, not even me. They stood at a distance, as if the grief in the room was contagious. I watched them with the same numbness I felt as a child whenever they visited familiar faces that felt like strangers in my life. Then my mother stepped forward to the casket and crafted the performance of her life. She cried loudly, apologizing to her father for not being there, begging him to forgive her failures. Her voice trembled in all the right places. Her hands shook just enough. Anyone else might have believed her. I didn't. I recognized the act, the way she used emotion like currency, spending it only when someone was watching. After the service, we gathered for the reading of the will. My grandfather's attorney opened the folder and the room stilled. He read the document in full, and with each line, my parents' expressions shifted from expectation to disbelief to fury. Every asset, every property, every dollar, more than $10 million in total, had been left to me. They each received a letter. Nothing more. My father erupted, first accusing me of orchestrating the entire thing. My sister muttered that I didn't deserve the Wynn name, as if it was a crown I'd stolen. I stayed silent, steadying my breath, knowing anger would only feed theirs. I opened my letter last. Inside, my grandfather had written truths he never shared aloud. He knew they cared more about his money than his life. He knew they would come after me. And he told me not to fear it, because he had spent years recording conversations, saving documents, keeping evidence, proof of their intentions should the day ever come. 2 days later, barely 48 hours after burying him, they hired an attorney and filed a lawsuit against me. They claimed I manipulated an old man, that I preyed on his declining health, that the will was the product of coercion. The papers were served to me at the cabin, still thick with the smell of flowers from his funeral. Standing there in the doorway, holding the lawsuit in my hands, I felt my grief transform into something sharper. Not hatred, not revenge, just clarity. My grandfather had warned me this day would come. And now that it was here, I understood the weight of what he meant when he told me not to tremble. This wasn't just about inheritance. It was about truth, legacy, and every quiet moment he and I had lived while the rest of them looked away. And as I folded the papers and placed them on the table, I felt the first shift inside me, the beginning of a battle I never asked for, but one I was finally ready to face. The lawsuit spread across Colorado faster than I could process it. Within 48 hours, my name was plastered on every local news site, the grandson who quietly inherited the Wynn empire, the mysterious heir, the prosecutor now under fire. Reporters swarmed outside my apartment and the DA's office cameras, flashing voices rising in a frenzy every time I stepped out of a door. I had spent my whole life avoiding the spotlight, carefully building a career on precision and silence, and now I was being dragged into a narrative written by people who had never even looked me in the eye. The summons arrived at my desk at the DA's office, accompanied by a formal notice requiring me to testify in the civil suit filed by my own parents. That alone should have been surreal, but the real shock was how the attention made me feel exposed, vulnerable, like my childhood was being peeled open for the world to inspect. I wasn't scared of court. I had lived in courtrooms for years. I was scared of being forced into the same arena as my parents, forced into their games of optics and manipulation, forced into their version of the truth. I was ordered to hand over any documents related to my grandfather's revised will. I spent nights pulling old files from storage boxes, reading through papers I hadn't touched in years, each page reminding me of moments I wasn't ready to relive. The pressure didn't just come from the lawsuit. It came from inside the walls of the place where I had built a name for myself. A senior prosecutor called me into his office, voice low and uneasy. Because I was under investigation in a civil dispute, he said they needed to avoid conflict of interest. Effective immediately, I was placed on unpaid leave for 2 weeks. The word stung not because of the money, but because of what it symbolized: suspicion, distance, a crack in the foundation I had spent years building. I didn't know where else to go, so I drove straight to Callahan's office. She had once been my grandfather's student, one of the few people who respected him, not just as a judge, but as a man who lived by the principles he taught. She listened to everything quietly, her face unreadable, then leaned back in her chair and said, "He didn't leave anything to chance. You're not alone in this. Not now, not ever." Her words anchored me, but the storm only grew stronger. When the court announced the judge assigned to the case, it became instant controversy. Judge Miller, my grandfather's former clerk, was appointed to preside over the lawsuit. My parents erupted through their attorney, arguing he would be biased in my favor. Meanwhile, the public chewed on the story like it was their latest entertainment. Their legal team escalated by accusing me of taking my grandfather to a secret hospital to influence his mental health. They produced hospital bills claiming I manipulated his medical care to weaken him mentally. For a moment, even I felt my stomach twist. Then Callahan requested the full records and the truth emerged. The facility wasn't a secret institution. It was a hospital designated for retired judges where he voluntarily went every year for cognitive evaluations. His mental assessments showed he was sound, clear-minded, and fully capable of making legal decisions. It hit me with an almost painful clarity. Then he had prepared for this. He had seen further ahead than any of us. All his records were precise, documented, protected. He had built a fortress of truth long before I knew I'd need it. But the more the truth tried to surface, the more vicious the attacks became. My parents weren't just fighting for money anymore. They were trying to bury me under scandal to break the credibility I had spent my entire adult life shaping. And as I looked around at the noise surrounding me, articles, accusations, lies, I realized the battle had shifted. This was no longer about inheritance. It was about defending the reputation of the only person who ever showed up for me. And it was about proving I was nothing like the people trying to destroy me. By the time the deposition hearings approached, the pressure felt like a physical weight on my chest. My parents had hired a PR firm known for bending narratives, and suddenly every radio program and podcast was dissecting my life as if they'd known me for years. The story being spun painted me as the greedy grandchild who preyed on a vulnerable old man. No one bothered to ask why the people accusing me had barely visited him in 20 years. To defend myself, I started speaking softly about the last years of my grandfather's life. I spoke about his independence, how he still managed his portfolio, how he read case law every night like it was scripture, how his memory remained sharper than mine. He had never been the confused, manipulated victim they portrayed. He had been deliberate and aware until the end. Then came the first hit from the other side. They produced a witness, a former employee from the cabin, who claimed my grandfather had begun forgetting important details and had seemed confused during the period he changed the will. The accusation was so blatantly false that it almost felt laughable, except I knew exactly who he was. a man my grandfather had fired for stealing antiques from the house, a man with a personal grudge and every reason to retaliate. The courts didn't know that story, but I did. Hearing his voice twist the truth made my stomach churn, but it also reminded me how far my parents were willing to reach. Not long after, another blow struck. My mother's bank records leaked online, revealing she had received regular payments from my grandfather for over 20 years, payments totaling more than $1 million. It destroyed her narrative of being excluded and mistreated, but it also placed me in a moral dilemma. If I used that information in court, would I be any different from them? Weaponizing old wounds to win a battle felt like a betrayal of everything my grandfather taught me. Right when I was drowning in that debate, my sister Sienna sent me a message. It was short, nearly shaking in tone, asking me to meet her privately. She said our mother had lied about a lot more than I knew, that she couldn't carry the guilt any longer. I didn't know what to expect, but I went. When she saw me, Sienna broke down, confessing that our mother had once begged our grandfather to place all his assets into a trust under her name. She admitted he refused, and that this rejection fueled years of resentment and distance. She also admitted she had been pressured to support our mother's narrative even when she knew it wasn't true. Her apology was raw, and hearing her say the words I had suspected for years still hit my chest harder than I expected. I drove home afterward, the mountains dark around me, snow drifting across the windshield. Her confession didn't just fill in cracks in the story, it exposed a long, tangled web of resentment, manipulation, and calculated motives spanning decades. My family hadn't simply drifted from my grandfather. They had orchestrated a narrative against him built on lies and self-preservation. This was never just a fight over money. This was the unraveling of years of deception, and I was finally standing in the center of it, staring at the truth they had spent a lifetime trying to bury. The morning of the final hearing arrived with a chill that settled deep into my bones. As I stepped out of the car, a wall of reporters surged toward me, shouts overlapping, microphones shoved forward, camera flashes bursting like gunfire. I felt the familiar urge to retreat, but I forced myself to breathe steady and controlled, repeating my grandfather's words in my mind. Truth doesn't need to shout. It only needs to stand firm. And so I walked through the chaos, as if moving inside a quiet tunnel only I could hear. Inside the courtroom, the tension felt thick enough to touch. My family sat on the plaintiff's side, my mother in an elegant black dress designed to look somber. My father stiff with rehearsed indignation, my sister staring at her hands. Their attorney, Richardson, radiated confidence. I took my seat beside Callahan, who whispered once, "Remember who taught you to fight." I nodded. Richardson began the proceedings with the same narrative they'd been building for weeks, insisting I had preyed on my grandfather's vulnerability, isolating him to force him to rewrite his will. He walked through each accusation with the smoothness of someone who'd done it hundreds of times. As he spoke, my mother delivered a performance worthy of an award. She cried softly, voice cracking, as she told the judge she'd been pushed aside by her father, that he had been confused and sadly manipulated by Troy. Every gesture was calculated, and watching her felt like watching a stranger wear her face. Callahan rose calmly when it was her turn. Instead of attacking, she presented facts with clinical precision. She showed security footage of my mother arriving at the cabin only to leave minutes later, too busy to stay when invited. She played audio recordings of conversations where my mother dismissed my grandfather's attempts to reach out. The courtroom shifted, whispers rustling like pages turning. My mother's mask faltered. Richardson quickly countered with a witness, an ex-employee from the cabin who claimed my grandfather was forgetful and confused during the period he changed his will. Hearing him lie, hearing him reduce a brilliant man to someone incapable, lit a slow burning anger in my chest. But anger didn't matter. Evidence did. Callahan produced medical records spanning 15 years, each one signed by specialists, confirming my grandfather's mental clarity. The room went silent as the judge read the reports, the truth shining plainly in the cold, legal language. When I was called to the stand, I told the court what 20 years with my grandfather looked like. Sunday dinners, arguments over case law, quiet walks through snow-covered forests, lessons on integrity and duty. I spoke simply without dramatizing because the truth had never needed embellishment. Then Richardson revealed something new, an email allegedly written by me suggesting I intended to control my grandfather's decisions. The moment I saw it, I knew it was fabricated. The wording wasn't mine. The tone wasn't mine. Callahan demanded a metadata analysis, and a digital forensic expert was brought in. After a tense few minutes, he confirmed what I suspected: the email had been altered on a device linked to my sister. The courtroom turned toward her. I saw her face drain of color. For a moment, she looked impossibly young, like the little girl I used to try to protect. Then she stood trembling and spoke. She admitted our mother pressured her to modify the document. She admitted that our mother had been trying for years to put my grandfather into a facility to gain access to his finances. She admitted she had stayed silent out of fear. My mother broke instantly, shouting that Sienna was lying, that I had manipulated her, that she was the victim. But her desperation rang hollow. My father sank back in his chair, eyes unfocused, the facade crumbling around him. When the judge announced the hearing would adjourn until the morning for final judgment, I felt the exhaustion hit me like a wave. I didn't know what the court would decide, but for the first time I saw the truth rising to the surface, undeniable and unfiltered. It was all I had asked for. I walked out of the courtroom with my chest tight, knowing everything now balanced on a few hours of waiting. I barely slept the night before the verdict. My mind kept circling back to my grandfather. His voice, his lessons, the weight of his hand on my shoulder when he told me not to tremble. I woke before sunrise, pulled out the pale blue shirt he had gifted me years ago, and wore it like armor. It wasn't superstition. It was a reminder of the man whose integrity shaped my life. The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the walls, every seat filled. My mother sat rigid, dark circles under her eyes. My father stared at the floor, avoiding everyone. Sienna kept her gaze low, her guilt settling on her shoulders like a heavy coat. I took my seat quietly, feeling the tension coil tight in my chest. Judge Miller entered with a stack of documents and a look that revealed nothing. He scanned the courtroom slowly before speaking, his voice steady but firm. He affirmed the legal validity of the will. He stated clearly that there was no evidence of coercion, manipulation, or diminished mental capacity. All accusations against me were dismissed in full. Then came the part none of us expected. The judge ruled that my family was responsible for all legal fees, punitive damages for defamation, and the costs of the prolonged litigation. Even I was stunned. They hadn't just lost, they had been exposed completely. When I stood, my knees felt weak, not from fear, but from relief. This wasn't just vindication. It was the clearing of my grandfather's name, the preservation of his truth. I walked out into the hallway, breathing fully for the first time in months. My mother approached me, her voice trembling. She apologized, blaming fear, desperation, insecurity. She said, "Troy, I'm still your mother." I looked at her, really looked, and felt nothing tethering us together anymore. I answered quietly, "The person who gave birth to me isn't always the person who raised me." Then I walked away before she could twist my words into something else. Sienna found me afterward, tears in her eyes. She apologized for years of silence, for playing along with a story she always knew was wrong. She asked if we could rebuild something real. I didn't promise her an answer. I simply told her that the door wasn't closed, but sincerity would have to be the first step. Before I could leave, Callahan handed me a small wooden box sealed with my grandfather's initials. Inside was a recording and a letter he had written for me. His voice filled the room, steady, warm, unwavering. He said that if I was listening, it meant truth had prevailed. He told me he trusted me not because I was his grandson, but because I had chosen integrity in a house shadowed by deceit. After the courthouse emptied, I drove back to Telluride. The cabin felt as still as the day he died. I walked through each room, touched the spines of the books he once read aloud, and felt the weight of his legacy settle into me. Not the financial one, but the moral one. In that quiet space, I made my decision. I accepted the nomination for the federal judgeship I had turned down before all this began. Not out of pride, but out of purpose. My grandfather had spent his life shaping justice. Now it was my turn to continue what he started. Standing at the doorway, looking out toward the snow-covered mountains he once pointed out to me when I was a child, I whispered into the cold air, "I kept my promise." Grandpa. When I stepped outside the cabin that evening, the sky had already surrendered to night, a deep indigo stretching endlessly above the mountains. Snow drifted in slow spirals, catching the faint porch light the way memories catch on the edges of your mind, quietly, insistently refusing to be forgotten. I stood there with my hands shoved into my coat pockets, breathing in air so cold it stung, but in a way that made me feel awake for the first time in years. Everything that had happened, every accusation, every lie, every moment in that courtroom, where I felt myself unraveling and rebuilding at the same time, hung over me like the fading remnants of a storm. And for the first time I realized I wasn't standing in the aftermath. I was standing in the beginning. I thought about the man who raised me, about how he had carried himself through a lifetime of judgment, conflict, and the weight of other people's choices, yet never once surrendered the part of himself that was rooted in truth. I had spent years thinking I needed to live up to him. But somewhere along the way I understood that wasn't what he wanted. He didn't raise me to be his echo. He raised me to be someone capable of facing the world without losing himself. And standing on that porch, listening to the wind drift over the pines, I realized I had done exactly that. What struck me most wasn't winning the case or the inheritance, or even the respect I had fought so hard to preserve. It was the quiet understanding that despite everything my family tried to do to fracture my identity, I had built a life that wasn't defined by them. My worth wasn't tied to their approval. My strength wasn't born from their absence. It came from the moments my grandfather chose me, not because he had to, but because love, when real, is a choice made again and again. People always talk about closure as if it's a door you lock behind you, but that's not what this felt like. It felt like stitching together something torn. It felt like breathing fully after years of holding my breath. I knew the wounds would linger, that parts of me would always ache when I thought about the boy I had been, the one who waited by windows hoping to see headlights that never came. But I also knew I wasn't that boy anymore. I had walked into a courtroom ready to defend my grandfather's legacy, and somehow in the process I reclaimed my own. Accepting the judgeship wasn't about power or achievement. It was about honoring the values that shaped me. It was about stepping into the life I had been building piece by piece since the first night my grandfather asked me what I'd learned about people. It was about recognizing that the story of my family didn't end with betrayal. It ended with truth. And from that truth, I was choosing to build something new. So if you're listening to this wherever you are, I want to say something I never thought I'd say out loud. Thank you. Thank you for sitting with me through this story, for letting my voice fill your space, for choosing to listen to something that was once too heavy for me to carry alone. Stories like mine, they're not easy to tell. They're stitched with hurt and fear and the kind of vulnerability most of us try to avoid. But sometimes speaking the truth out loud is the only way to take back the parts of yourself you didn't realize you'd lost. Before you go, if my story has meant something to you, if it's reminded you of your own strength or your own survival or the quiet resilience you've had to build in the dark, I hope you'll consider staying connected. Tap subscribe, leave a comment, share your own story if you feel ready. Not because numbers matter, but because connection does. Because somewhere out there is someone who needs to hear that they're not alone, that family doesn't have to be defined by blood, and that the hardest chapters of our lives don't have to be the ones that define us. I'm Troy Calum Wynn, and this was the truth I spent a lifetime learning how to tell. And wherever you are, whatever you've lived through, I hope you find the strength to tell your story too. Because sometimes speaking it is the first step toward becoming who you were meant to be.